This simple farmhouse in Haverhill, Massachusetts was, in 1807, the birthplace of John Greenleaf Whittier. Whittier, despite his labor-filled origins as an uneducated farm boy, would rise to become a nationally known poet and devoted anti-slavery activist whose words helped to stir a lax nation into action. Religion empowered Whittier. His Quaker background deepened his humanity and kindled his moral indignation as an abolitionist. Farm boy, Quaker, poet, editor, politician, and abolitionist. These are the diverse roles fulfilled throughout a long lifetime by John Greenleaf Whittier.
The farm life was tough. Whittier was not well. At one time, Whittier had 7 cows to milk. But he did his chores and did the farm work, helped in the woods. Whittier attributes his ill health to the fact that he, like all, I guess, the farm boys of the time, went through what was considered a toughening process. They didn't have flannel and woolen clothing. They wore homespun, and they practically froze to death during the winter. And Whittier thinks that his ill health can be attributed to that. Whittier did a great deal of reading. There are very few books in the family library. He knew the Bible practically by heart, but he read all the books here in the library. Perhaps the first landmark is his attendance at Haverhill Academy. That brought him an entirely new vista of society and of the kind of people that actually existed in the world. And so it really was an opening of a door. Although he had only 2 terms of formal education at the academy, he really was a well-educated man and a proper companion for people like Longfellow and Hawthorne and so forth.
Whittier's earlier years at the Haverhill farmhouse bestowed him with a respect for hard work and simple living, a closeness with his family members, and an appreciation of nature. These values, combined with his Quaker heritage of individual spiritualism and social equality, to shape Whittier's character.
The Quakers were outcasts in a way. They went by their own lights. They refused to follow the dictates of the Congregationalist, the Puritan faith. And so the Whittiers were isolated in terms of their community. And you find that sort of paradoxical nature in Whittier, that the Quaker was not a part of New England. The Whittiers came into the faith. Whittier practiced the faith, yet the faith prevented him, for example, from wholeheartedly entering into, say, the Civil War. And so you've got this split in Whittier of attachment to a locale and being different from a locale. The associations, the friends, the events that framed and shaped his poetry later on were Haverhill-oriented. One of the strengths of Whittier's poetry is his grasp of the local environment, that is, his absorption of it and his use of it, and his replaying of it in terms of the backdrop for his drama. But more importantly, the area figures as the sort of the moral geography. It has a symbolic and a wider reference than just describing trees and fish and water. And the poem Telling the Bees is a good example. There he uses the birthplace.
Here is the place. Right over the hill runs the path I took. You can see the gap in the old wall still, and the stepping stones in the shallow brook.
The poem called The Countess deals with Rock's Village, which is now a few landmarks. And he describes Rock Village had a bridge over the Merrimack, a covered bridge. And Whittier describes the town as he'd seen it so often going from Haverhill to Amesbury.
Over the wooded northern ridge, between its houses brown, to the dark tunnel of the bridge, the street comes straggling down. You catch a glimpse through birch and pine of gable, roof, and porch, the tavern with its swinging sign, the sharp horn of the church.
He uses the local texture, his own memories, to go from kith to kin, as they say, to go from the particular to the universal. He worked as an editor in Boston. He worked as an editor in Philadelphia. He worked as an editor in Hartford. And his education into the world came by going to these cities with jobs. And jobs that had nothing to do with poetry. They had to do with politics. They had to do with practical events. By the time he was nearly 30, Whittier had decided that poetry was not the route to fame and success, and that practical politics and getting elected to Congress was. Whittier was a very shrewd, practical, working politician, a good part of his life. What he did, though, when he couldn't get into Congress and jobs failed, in the sense of providing with enough money, he enlisted in a cause. From 1833 on, Whittier was an abolitionist, and that meant almost totally. He wrote abolitionist verses. He edited abolitionist papers. He was fired from papers when he wouldn't write the proper editorials, and when he refused to back pro-slavery sentiments. He was rotten egged in Newburyport. He was stoned in Concord. He was burned out in Philadelphia. That's a fairly exciting group of events for a mild Quaker pacifist.
Whittier was undergoing a profound emotional and moral transformation as his focus shifted from farm life to political activism. His Quaker values of humanitarianism and social equality would travel with him, guiding his pen to become a weapon in the battle to end human slavery. The next 20 years would place Whittier's name in the pages of American history.
Well, Haverhill had an anti-slavery society, but Whittier's work, of course, was far beyond Haverhill. After Whittier had written Justice and Expediency, which was the most reasoned and researched paper on slavery to date, he became known nationally. And his poetry and some of his other articles brought him, of course, a tremendous amount of national attention, much of it anti, because he roused a great deal of anger on the part of the clergy and politicians and citizens generally, because, as you know, even in New England, there were a great many people who thought that slavery was the best answer to economic problems. He did consider being a politician, but once he started on the abolitionist cause, everything else was subordinated. And he didn't start until after serious and prayerful consideration. He said he think that really God called him to be an abolitionist. I think the fervor and zeal of that cause gave him some of the better poetry that he'd written to that point, because it had a real sincere and spirited tone to it.
Hold while ye may your struggling slaves, and burden God's free air with women's shriek beneath the lash and manhood's wild despair. Cling closer to the cleaving curse that writes upon your plains the blasting of almighty wrath against a land of chains.
He worked in Philadelphia for 2 years and came back in the late 1830s and 1840s to stay in Amesbury. He was really never to leave again. And it's here that Whittier became the poet. And the return to home roots is really what went on in this area of Whittier's life. From the late 1840s to the advent of the Civil War, Whittier was what was called a corresponding editor, which means he could stay at home and write his pieces and receive some pay. It was in the 1850s, then, doing this job, that Whittier began to get some sort of national prominence. The Civil War was the culmination, in a way, of Whittier's reform work. And it's ironic that the Quaker was as responsible as any public writer we have for the Civil War. As an abolitionist writer, he wrote propagandist verses. And these verses were published in the local newspapers. Then they were hawked throughout the streets in broadside form. They were reprinted by the thousands. They were distributed all throughout the country. For having one of these verses or having books with Whittier's verses in them, you could be imprisoned. These abolitionist verses had a tremendous emotional effect.
Up, laggards of freedom! Our free flag is cast to the blaze of the sun and the wings of the blast. Will ye turn from a struggle so bravely begun, from a foe that is breaking, a field that's half won?
His verses became a touchstone, sort of exploding force that caused the Civil War. The verses were read, and Lincoln said, "Those are the sort of verses I want my soldiers to read, because they'll be better soldiers, they'll fight harder." This from a Quaker.
The birds against the April wind flew northward, singing as they flew. They sang, "The land we leave behind has swords for corn blades, blood for dew." O wild birds flying from the south, what saw and heard ye, gazing down? We saw the mortar's upturned mouth, the sickened camp, the blazing town. Beneath the bivouac's starry lamps, we saw your march-worn children die. In shrouds of moss, in cypress swamps, we saw your dead uncoffined lie. We heard the starving prisoners' sighs, and saw from line and trench your sons follow our flight with homesick eyes beyond the battery's smoking guns. And heard and saw ye only wrong and pain, I cried, O wing-worn flocks. We heard, they sang, the freedman's song, the crash of slavery's broken locks.